Welcome to the Holy Donors Podcast. Join Andrew, Matt, Ren, and me, Thaddeus, as every week we bring you inspiring stories of radical generosity that have changed the world. So Andrew, you ready to get started?
Can't wait.
Winning is not a sometime thing, it's an all-the-time thing. You don't win once in a while, and you don't do things right once in a while. You do them right all the time. Winning is a habit. You gotta play with your heart, with every ounce of fiber in your body. I've never known a man worth his salt who deep down in his heart didn't appreciate the grind, the discipline, and to win, and to win, and to win. It is and always has been an American seal, and that's to be first, regardless of what we do. There's no room for second place. There's only one place, and that's first place. I finished second twice in my time, and I don't ever want to finish second again. But I firmly hold that a man's finest hour, the greatest fulfillment to anything he holds dear, is that moment when he has worked his heart out in a good cause and lays exhausted on the field of battle, victorious.
Welcome back to another season of Holy Green Bay Packers. Holy Donors. As we get ready for a new season, I'm excited to hear where we're going and about our new subject's life and what he did to be not only holy, but also to be philanthropically giving.
Potentially.
That is a question mark. I forget to always add the question mark in my voice.
Yeah.
So first, before we get started, let's introduce the cast. I'm Matt.
Howdy, I'm Andrew Robinson, and I am more or less the expert on this season. I've done the research on our spotlight for the season, and I'm excited to share with you guys the points, and then we'll have a good discussion on whether he ranks as a holy donor.
And I'm Ren Hain. I'm here to play the devil's advocate today, having grown up in Minnesota. We'll see how this goes.
Yeah, really. And Thaddeus is going to join us for probably some of the episodes.
But not this episode.
Yeah.
As the season started, we heard a great kind of motivational piece. It came from some excerpts of his speech over time. It's quite motivational. Many of you probably just from that one alone know exactly who we're going to focus on for this season. For those of us who may not know who we're looking at or we're going to spotlight, Andrew, you want to shed some light on who this great person is?
Yeah, so the subject of this season is going to be Coach Vince Lombardi. And one of Lombardi's most famous quotes, probably his most famous quote over time, is, "Winning isn't everything, it's the only thing." And that is how a lot of people think of Coach Lombardi. They think of him as a driver, as a winner, as somebody incredibly successful as a coach and a motivator. And a lot of people probably also know that he was a very devout Catholic. And so we decided to highlight and to do some research on Vince Lombardi for this season. And I learned a ton. One of my main sources is the book When Pride Still Mattered by David Marinus. Also used some other sources to kind of supplement that, but just learned a whole heck of a lot about Coach Lombardi, about the start of football, about the creation of the NFL. And it was just really a good season. I'm excited to share about his story.
You know, I can't wait to hear about everything that you just spoke of, especially how he took his Catholic faith maybe onto the gridiron in one way or another. Gosh, such a famous football player. And, you know, we haven't had the opportunity to share about a football player. We've talked baseball with Babe Ruth from season 5, but we haven't had the opportunity to talk about a football player. So I'm excited about that. It's one of my favorite sports to spectate. Never played, but I love to watch it as, growing up a huge OSU fan. And right now we're recording in College Station, Texas, which is home of the
Fighting Texas Aggies.
That's right. And, you know, the first time we came down here, I learned what that whoop means because that's kind of interesting to all of us non-Texas Aggies. Yeah. So, but I can't say whoop. Only you can say whoop, right?
I mean, you could say it. It just means less coming from you.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
Yeah. But it would kind of be like talking about our player today, our subject today, it would kind of be like saying "Go Cheeseheads" or "Go Pack" if you're not an actual Packers fan.
Right.
So-
But we know that Ren is a huge Packers
He
fan.
loves
right?
the Packers.
Go Pack, go. That's their very unique chant.
Okay. Well, it's so cold. The mouth is covered most of the time, anyways, in those games. So you got to keep the cheers short, right?
Right.
While wearing the cheese on your head. Right?
Yes, exactly.
All right. So, in the story of the great man, Vince Lombardi, where do we start?
Yeah, so let's go back to his childhood. So Vince Lombardi grew up in Brooklyn, technically in Sheepshead Bay. His father, Harry, owned a meat market, and his father, Harry, was an interesting guy. He was short and wide. They called him Old 5x5 because they said he was 5 feet tall and 5 feet wide. He was incredibly strong because he worked with heavy slabs of meat his entire life. And he was the tattooed butcher. And this was back in, Vince was born in 1913, so this was back many years ago, even before World War I.
Wow.
And so somebody who had tattoos everywhere, and in fact on his hands, on his knuckles, on one hand it said work, and on his other hand he had the word play. So that really defines kind of who Harry Lombardi was. He was a burly guy, he was a tough guy, and he loved to work and he loved to play. And that was kind of the household that Vince grew up in. His mom was Matilda, and she was an Izzo. She came from the Izzo family, and the Izzo family was huge, 13 aunts and uncles, and both Italian Catholic families. And so that was kind of the world that Vince grew up in. Was it a disciplinarian or a tough father, tough, strong father who loved to cut up sometimes? And his mother was a very proper Italian mom who loved to cook, who loved to always dress her finest, and she was really the disciplinarian in the family.
Were his parents immigrants?
His grandparents were immigrants. So my understanding is that Harry and Maddie were both born in America, but their parents immigrated over from Italy.
They're still pretty fresh, though.
Yeah, exactly.
And you just refer to Matilda as Maddie. Is that what
Yeah.
she went by?
Yeah, exactly. So Harry and Maddie were his parents, and then his grandfather, who did immigrate, was Tony. And Tony was another...
A Tony.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Antonio, right? Another Tony. And Tony was a barber. He ran a barber shop there in town. And Tony, with his barber shop, was also a hub for gambling. And all the family grew up kind of around sports, really rooting for the winners, trying to make money off of the games. So that was a pretty, I guess a pretty typical childhood for an Italian immigrant family in Brooklyn. The trinity of Vince's childhood were religion, very Catholic, family all stuck together, and sports. So that was kind of Vince's childhood growing up.
So that must have been a unique childhood because, having 13 aunts and uncles from a very sports-centric, very, very religious family.
Yeah.
But they were all close-knit. I mean, that must have been a fun time to live, but also a tough time to live because you had probably at that point in time when you talk marriages and kids and whatnot, you probably are talking 100 people kind of right there looking over your shoulder the whole time.
Yeah, in fact, every Sunday, all of Vince's childhood growing up, every Sunday they gathered at his house. And Maddie Izzo would host, and they would have a meal, their Sunday family dinner, and it would usually be a 4 or 5 hour affair. Everybody would bring food, and everybody would bring sides, and there were times that there was 90 or 100 people there, including all the cousins. Vince was one of the older cousins and certainly one of the bigger cousins, and so he kind of took it on himself to be a little bit of an enforcer. He wrangled all the younger cousins, his brothers and sisters certainly, and that was kind of, he was kind of the boss, right? He liked to be in control. He liked that power.
Yeah.
So you said they were big in sports. Was football their sport? Or I know when you're talking early 1900s in the U.S., I think the biggest sports back then would have been horse racing, baseball, boxing. Is that what were they following?
Yeah, good question. So I'm sure they've watched all of it, especially if Tony and his buddies were betting on all of it.
Or listen to it on the radio.
Or listen to it on the radio. Yeah, exactly. Right. This is even before TV. You're right. But they went to meets in person to watch as much as they could. But yeah, they loved football. Vince was a football guy through and through. He started playing even as a child. I mentioned earlier, religion, family, and sports. So we kind of talked about family, big extended family, gathered every Sunday. Sports, he loved playing football, but religion really was the most important thing in Vince's life. In fact, from a very early age, he wanted to be a priest. He felt a lot of pride and felt a lot of honor, and he really felt called to that. In fact, his buddies, and he kind of became known as Father Vince around the neighborhood.
That's interesting you say that because, growing up Catholic myself, it really sheds a lot of light into how he grew up with his family dynamic, whether it was his direct siblings and his parents or even the extended family of 100, that they not only they were tight-knit, but they also put so much weight into this that they pass that along to their kids. If you don't have that, then the idea of becoming a priest never pops in as a potential. He probably would have been a butcher or whatnot.
Yeah, he was an altar server. They attended daily mass as often as possible, and church was very important to them. They had a lot of priest friends. Religion was just a part of the everyday life of the Izzo and the Lombardi family. One other thing that I want to mention is that Harry was a tough father. I mentioned that he was burly. His mom was the enforcer of the rules. She was really the one that wanted things to be in their place. She enforced that discipline. But Harry was tough as well. And Harry had a line that Vince would talk about for really his whole life, that nobody is ever hurt. It's all in your mind. And so there were multiple times that, and this was just Harry's life. Like he couldn't hurt his arm and then not work that day, because if he wasn't pulling those slabs of meat, then they weren't getting the job done and he was going to lose customers. And so it was very much you're not hurt. It's all in your head. Get back out there, kid.
This is, if Thaddeus was here, he'd be doing his The Butcher of Brooklyn.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, good for filling in for him. That's good.
We'll get back to the interview in just a second, but first, here's a quick message.
So recently I had an issue with a plumbing leak. I knew that I could figure it out on my own, but after spending an entire day, including 3 trips to the hardware store and $40 in parts, it was still leaking. Finally, I broke down and asked someone at the store, who told me about a $5 kit with all the pieces that I needed. I got home and had the issue fixed in 10 minutes. What a pain, but also what a lesson learned. If I had just asked somebody who knew what they were doing, the cost of paying for their expertise would have more than made up for the time and money I wasted experimenting with my own fixes. The same principle is true in fundraising. The Petrus Annual Manual provides your ministry with access to the experience and knowledge of current best practices in fundraising, so you can skip the trial and error. The plan and guidance will accelerate the entire process and allow you to immediately implement fundraising activities that actually work to build a strong foundation for your fundraising efforts. Where would your organization be today if you had invested in your development program 5 years ago? What ministry and outreach will you be leaving on the table 5 years from now if you don't invest in your fundraising today? To learn more about the Petrus Annual Manual, visit our website at petrusdevelopment.com/annual manual.
So what about school?
Yeah, so Harry was a high school dropout, so he never did finish high school, but he was really good with math, so he was able to run his business. So it's very important that all the kids, Vince and everybody, finish schools, because that was something that Harry never did. So they all went to Catholic school, and Vince had an option to go to St. Francis, which had a good football program, or to go to Cathedral College of the Immaculate Conception, which was a preparatory seminary, but they didn't have a football program. And so everybody thought that Vince was going to pick St. Francis because he was so good at football. He loved it so much. And he surprised everybody by saying, no, I want to go to Cathedral and because I want to be a priest.
Wow.
Yeah, so he was a daily mass communicant. School was very important, Catholic school. And he was very devoted to the saints, St. Jude and St. Anthony in particular.
Was there anything that, while he was growing up, pointed to this piety that he had at such a young age?
Yeah, I don't know. Later on, he adopts a lot of his spiritual practices and spiritual devotions from the Jesuits. But that was really comes out of his time at Fordham University. So I don't know early on. I think that it was just this, the family, right? Like this Italian Catholic family, right? Yeah. Faith is important. The priest is very revered, very honored by the family members. And then later on in life, again, coming out of the Jesuit experience, but he he really thrives on discipline. In fact, that's what makes him such a successful coach. But he was a very disciplined young man. And so probably that discipline, and then he found that outlet in church and in his faith. And so the two kind of just melded together in his life at an early age.
Yeah, wow.
I think it's interesting that he has a devotion to St. Jude at this time, because as we learned way back in season 1 with Danny Thomas, St. Jude is a pretty recent devotion in the church, and it kind of came out of the U.S., but in a little bit later in the 1900s, mid-1900s, right?
Yeah.
So, it's interesting that he found St. Jude and kind of developed a devotion to him this early.
Yeah, he did. And that devotion and his piety really, took him through cathedral, and he was on track to be Father Vince until his third year in high school.
Until his third year of high school, what happened after that?
Yeah, so there was a priest, Father James Smith, and he would run the third-year students through this. They called it a spiritual incantation. But basically, all the boys would sit in a room and they would say, "I want to be a priest. I want to be a priest. I want to be a priest." And they would just say this over and over again. And the priest, Father Smith, would say, "You have to feel it. You have to really, if you want to be a priest, if you have to say this with conviction." And it was during these exercises that Vince ultimately said, "I don't feel it. I don't feel called to be a priest. Faith is still important to me. All right, I'm not being called to be Catholic, but I'm not going to be a priest." And so it was really in his third year that he discerned out of this life as Father Vince.
I can't even imagine being put into a room with a bunch of your peers, and that was an exercise that they did. I mean, that's
different times, right? Like,
yeah.
yeah. So after that year, he did leave, and he transferred over to St. Francis Catholic School. He had been playing football all along, but on Saturdays. And so he would play sandlot football, and now he was able to play during the week for the team. So he was really good, and he was ultimately recruited to go to Fordham University to play, which was one of the best football programs in America at the time.
Wow, what position was he playing?
So he was a small guy, but he was always on the line. And at this time in football, everybody played both ways. Everybody played offense and defense. And so he was a lineman, and he was a small guy. Like I said, I want to say when he was at Fordham, he was around 5'10", 180 pounds. So, that's not a big lineman.
Yeah.
Do we have any idea what the average size would have been back then?
Well, that was pretty average then.
Okay.
But now it's not. Now linemen are 250, 300 pounds easily.
Yeah.
But at the
6'3", 6'5", 6'9".
Yeah. But at the time, either guys weren't that big at that age, and so they didn't have, a large enough pool of players like that, or they just had different style of play. But linemen were smaller, and Vince was pretty average, but he was pretty small.
On top of that, I'm just going to assume that this was the time of leather helmets and no pads of any type.
Yeah, very little padding, no face mask, leather helmets. Yeah, and in fact, it was a very aggressive style of play. It is today, right? It's a very violent sport, but then people got beat up. And when he was at Fordham, he had a nickname. He had a lot of nicknames over his time, but one of his biggest nicknames was Butch. Everybody would call him Butch because he was a bruiser. And you think of a Butch, and you think of somebody that's going to knock your socks off, and that was Vince. He was very aggressive. He loved the violent side of football. His entire life as a player, as a coach, he loved the violence of football, but he loved that it was a controlled violence. You step off the field, and he had no hatred for the other team. He didn't want to chase people down in the parking lot. Like, it was all on the field. But when he was on the field, he was very aggressive and very violent player.
I'm going to assume that he also brought back the famous words from Papa Harry of nobody ever gets hurt. It's all in your head when he was playing the game like that.
Yeah. He was actually nearsighted as well. And so this kind of gave him an advantage because he couldn't see everybody very far away. He could only see close. And so he would just hit them with reckless abandon. It's the way that Marinus explained it. So I thought that was pretty great. There was a game, and I can't think this was at Fordham, when he got a cut in his mouth and it was bleeding. He's spitting blood, and he kept playing. And after the game, he needed to get like 30 stitches in his mouth.
Oh, wow. But
that was like how they played. Again, everybody played offense and defense. So you didn't have 100 member squads, right, where you could put in a sub. Like, you had to play. And if you tweaked your ankle on a play, there was nobody else that was coming in behind you. Coach said, get back out there and play. So very violent sport, and he was always beat up, but he, like you said, he stuck with what Harry said. It's all in his mind, right?
Yeah.
There was one time, though, kind of led to a funny story, that Lombardi was injured. And so after the game, he was all beat up, and he couldn't even get out of his bed. And so he's sitting in his bed in his dorm, and he sees a buddy passing by, and he calls buddy down, and he says, hey, I need you to go get me a priest. And he says, what do you need a priest for? He says, I got to make my confession, but I can't get out of bed and walk there. So, I mean, he was like... And I'm sure he played the next week, right? You know, he didn't even get a week off. But that was, again, that like sort of blending of football and religion. It just kind of all went together. He couldn't take a day off of football, and he couldn't take a day off of his faith.
So speaking of this, we're at a time in his life at college.
Yeah.
You know, in today's day and age, college is a very liberal time in a person's life, so to speak. But you just said he took his faith seriously during his college time. Is there anything that points to that from your research?
Yeah, so he really adopted the practices of the Jesuits there when he was at Fordham. And the Jesuits really focus on duty, obedience, responsibility, and the exercise of free will. Those are kind of four of the pillars of the Jesuit practice of faith. And that fits, I mean, you can tell that fits Vince like a T, right? Obedience. You know, there's always somebody else who knows what you should be doing and is going to help direct you. Responsibility, right? Like if you're injured, it doesn't matter. There's somebody that's relying on you. You got to get out there and you got to deliver. And then the exercise of free will. We are all called to choose good, but later on in life, he makes it very clear that our free will is best employed when we are choosing to support the body of Christ and to support our team. He was a big proponent of the importance of team, which probably came out of his, the importance of family growing up. So another thing that came out of his time and training at Fordham, especially with the Jesuits, is that ties back into that clip at the beginning. You remember the clip when he said winning isn't everything, is the only thing, and winning is a habit, is that in order to develop a winning attitude and be able to be successful on the field of football, is you have to have precision and you have to have discipline and you have to have those habits. And during his time at Fordham, that's really when the key to developing those habits was kind of ground into Vince. He kept those habits incorporated into his coaching style his entire life.
Wow.
So Fordham was really where his faith and his spiritual practices kind of like melded them into his life in a way that he was never going to leave. He was a daily mass communicant his entire life. He went to confession all the time. All of his kids were baptized. All of his grandkids were baptized in the church. His kids were married in the church. So faith was very important, and it was really here that Fordham where he developed his own style of the practice of the faith, which incidentally then bled into his approach to coaching.
Andrew, you've mentioned the Jesuits a few times.
Right.
We know that the university that he was attending, Fordham, was a Jesuit university, the first Catholic Jesuit college in the U.S.
Okay.
Ren, I know you know a little bit about this. Tell me something about the Jesuits.
The Jesuits are founded by St. Ignatius of Loyola. He was a soldier, and he got hit by a cannonball and was in bed recovering for quite a long time. Spent that time reading, learning, came back to the faith, and he kind of developed the Jesuit spirituality as a result of that. And some of the pieces of it, like the spiritual exercises, which are still a common framework for making a retreat that's used today. And St. Ignatius brought a lot of kind of the military philosophies with him as he developed, what became the Jesuit spirituality, the concepts of obedience, a spiritual battle, the free will, these things that Andrew mentioned that were the kind of the common pillars of that spirituality he developed and brought with him. And so I can see how it applied to what they were teaching and how Vince was applying that to his life, and especially he developed his kind of football philosophy.
Yeah, it's, you mentioned obedience, free will, the spiritual battle. It was a lot of discipline within the Jesuits, and that came out of St. Ignatius. And really, anyone can work towards a state of perfection if they approach it with enough zeal. The spiritual exercises call for daily reflections on sin, and the football coaches, the programs which Lombardi implemented his entire life, even kind of implemented this with a scorecard to show your improvements on the football field. So a lot of Coach Lombardi's coaching philosophy comes directly out of his experience with the Jesuits, and in particular this sort of military background that St. Ignatius had when he formed the Jesuits.
Do you have thoughts or comments to share with the show or ideas for future Holy Donor subjects? Send them to us, and your comments might be included in a season wrap party. Get in touch with us on Instagram @Holy Donors.
So we've talked religion. We've talked some football in college. As we all know, when you're that age, you start looking at settling down or finding a romantic partner. Was there anything in Vince's life during this time?
Yeah, when he was a junior, he met a young lady named Marie, and they went out on a couple of dates, and that was really the only girl that he ever dated. They ended up getting married eventually, but Vince's life really was playing football, didn't have a lot of time for anything else. So once he found Marie, he said, I think I can marry this girl. She was really infatuated with him, and so eventually they got married.
So it sounds like things were going well through college. Was there? You said that Fordham was a really good football program, known for being good. Were they good while he was on the team?
Yeah, so they were really good. And in fact, Vince played a little bit his freshman and sophomore year, but he didn't really start playing until his junior year. That was because the team was just so good. They were stacked. And they, in fact, I'm going to mess this up, but Notre Dame had an excellent football team at this time as well. And a writer coined the term the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse as the Notre Dame line. They were so good. They were the Four Horsemen. And then that name kind of spawned another name. The Fordham line was called the Seven Blocks of Granite. And Vince was one of those, because over the time that Vince was there, they had 7 really key linemen who were basically as strong as granite. And in fact, they were kind of mythologized through this poem, which I'll read it real quick. Great mighty Minnesota fell upon that fateful day. Both Yale and Army felt the axe and tossed their crowns away. Big Holy Cross and early boss, here's no more winning bands. Yes, strange things happen everywhere, but the Fordham wall still stands. Once Carthage ruled an ancient coast, but where is Carthage now? The Grecian phalanx no more wears the winning olive bough. And where are Persia's ruling hosts that ruled all warring lands? Their day is done by sand and sun, but the Fordham wall still stands. Who took the brutal thrust of SMU and rolled its charges back? Who stood the gales upon their heels and broke up each attack? Who held young Goldberg at the line with willing hearts and hands? The answer rings from coast to coast. The Fordham wall still stands.
You know, that poem makes me want to put on a football helmet and go hit somebody.
And run through a wall. Yeah. I mean, it was, again, but that's how football was at this time, right? It was played by really aggressive men who laid it all on the field, who didn't experience pain, who played 60 minutes both ways, and at the end of the day, if they weren't crawling off the field, they didn't do their job. And that was the football that really formed Vince Lombardi as a player and then ultimately as a coach.
And interesting enough, I'm sure, as this poem, of course, shows, spectators kind of romanticized that war that was going on the gridiron.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you're talking about 1936, 1937. So they've lived through World War I. You know, we're kind of gearing up for World War II here. And then they didn't have TVs. And so it was really, and radio was there, but it was really the writers who brought football to life, the sports writers.
Yeah.
And so these sort of mythologized poems and really eloquent stories about the teams, that's how people experience the game if they weren't there or they weren't able to read it. And so it was a very romantic time, even though the game was so inherently violent.
Yeah. Wow. So it sounds like he had a great time at Fordham. He met his future wife. He progressed within his faith tremendously. But I'm really curious, what was next in his football career?
Yeah. Well, I will tell you, but I'm going to tell you next episode.
Can't wait.
All right. Fantastic.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Holy Donors, brought to you by Petrus Development in cooperation with Red Sea Catholic Radio and Back Row Media. Theme music by Tommy Kibb, Third Top Productions. Graphics by 86 Creative. If you like us, leave us a review, share us with your friends, and check us out at holydonors.com and on Instagram at holydonors. Holy Donors, bringing you inspiring stories of radical generosity that have changed the world.
Hey, Matt, why did the football coach go to the bank?
Why?
To get his quarterback.
That was gold.
Yeah, it's a good thing you're recording, huh?
What do the Green Bay Packers and a Chick-fil-A manager have in common?
What's that?
Neither one shows up for work on Sunday.
Oh, burn. Grethel the tittle tattle prattled on about the little metal bottle. She spat a spit of spettle on the moth that bit the cattle in a bitter battle. That's how Dwight Schrute warms up.